So we're going to begin chapter 10, dealing with history and education. And so the title of the chapter is what is it? The history of America's struggle for educational opportunity. And as we go through this, it's not a really long chapter, but there are some important things I think we need to address just to kind of give you an overall view of what education is like today based on where it came from and kind of the historical background of how it's changed, because I think you can't really appreciate what education's like today until you understand what it used to be like. And so as we go through and talk about some of these things, keep that in mind. The purpose is to see what it used to be like so we appreciate what we have today, and also maybe see changes coming and it can be influential in new changes that might occur. So let's start with some themes in American education. And these are pretty common themes. If you look in your book on page 309-ish, let me see. No, 305. It talks about some of these themes and goes into a lot of detail in each of these. The first theme is local control. So you know, or I'm sure you know, we've talked about it a little bit, that schools are governed by a local school board. Okay, and we'll talk more about this in chapter 11 too, when we talk about how they're governed, how laws are made, and who is in charge. But the local control was a big thing. And so this concept began during the 19th century when school districts began to form. And the fear was that if the federal government had control, then their control would be too strong. And there was, in the Constitution, there was no framework for what education should be like. And so that was the fear. And so as a result, state governments had some authority, but then they began to give that authority to local school district or local school boards. Also, the theme of universal education became popular and is popular. We'll talk more about that shortly, along with public education. Also, comprehensive education is an important theme. Secular education, changing ideas of the basics, and then expanding definitions of educational access and equality. So you could probably think back to various movies and different things maybe that you've read where you see what education used to be like. A movie that comes to my mind is the movie Remember the Titans. If you haven't seen it, it's a great movie. Go watch it. But you get an idea about in the 60s what it was like for schools to be segregated. And you begin to see integration happen. And the story revolves around the football team, but you see so much more than that. You see the educational background, and you see how these different groups of people, based on the color of their skin, were considered different, or one was better than another, and so on. And you see at the end how they come together, which is kind of a neat thing, because now in our schools there is that coming together much more so than it used to be. And so again, we want to look at what are these themes, how are they influencing education, how have they influenced education. Again, we'll talk about each of these in a little more detail as we move through. Just kind of as a quick note, the universal education is the idea that education was for everybody. Okay? And so we know now that today every student goes to school. Every kid that is school aged goes to school. Public education became big, where it was available to everybody, instead of just the upper class people that were paying for it. And so that became a major theme and is a major theme in education still today. The comprehensive education was the idea that you needed to be able to read, write, and do arithmetic, but there was more to it. This idea was that you needed to be able to do those things, and those had to be things you were good at to be able to be functioning in society, but there's more to education than just those things. The secular education is when religious training became a predominant thing. Obviously, we don't have that much today, but over the course of American education, that has been a very key part to public education. And then this changing idea of the basics. So, long time ago, 19th century, for example, a lot of things were taught through the great classic works. In chapter 9, we talked about the perennialism. That philosophy dealt a lot with using the great books, the great classic books to teach. And so that was a very common thought, is that's what you used to teach. And so that idea has changed to, we can look at other things and learn from other writings and from other educational material besides just those great classic works. And then expanding the definition of educational access and equality. Again, this is going to get into who is allowed to get education and some of those things. So all of these themes have played a major impact in education in the United States. And so as we go through this chapter, we're going to talk about some of those in detail and really get into to each of these to an extent pretty in depth. And so I would encourage you to read in your book pages 305 to 307, because it does kind of get into deeper detail about each of these in the first section. So let's talk about colonial education. When education, well, let me back up. When the United States was founded, the founding fathers of this country knew that people needed to be educated. There needed to be a school system or schooling for children. But it was not necessarily for all children. Okay? It was for some children, became more for all children later on, but really kind of focused on the wealthier children. And so across the country, and we're thinking, again, this is when the country is established, right? So it's pretty much the eastern side of the country, from the New England states and Northeast through the middle colonies, which is going to take you to about Missouri. Okay, those middle, from Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, all of those middle colonies, and then what we think of as the South. Your Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, all of those states being the southern part. And so the way education was approached in each of these areas was different, because their lifestyles were different. The type of people living in these areas was different. And so in the New England area, you had dame schools. And in these dame schools, these were schools where girls a lot of times would learn basic household skills like cooking and sewing and learning how to become a housewife, essentially. Now, is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. But the idea was that women were going to stay in the house and work in the house, when men were going to go to a job and make the money and be the provider of the financial support for the household. And so the little bit of education that women were allowed was going to be to prepare them to be able to stay at home and take care of the home. Also, in the New England states, you had the first town and district schools. So, the town schools were schools where you would have several families that lived in an area that would hire a teacher to teach this one little group of kids. And so, again, on page 308 in your book, it talks about this. And you may have 50 or more families that were obligated to pay one person to come in and teach your kids how to read and write. And so that's how the town schools began. And as you had more families come along and you had people that were more spread out, you began to get the district schools where you would have, under one leadership, maybe you would have multiple people teaching at multiple schools. So you may have, 2 or 3 little town schools that were kind of led by one person. They say, okay, I'm going to hire this teacher to go teach at this little school over here that's got 50 kids. And I'm going to teach this teacher to go or hire this teacher to go teach this group of 50 kids. I'm going to hire another teacher to go teach this other group of 50 kids. And so you begin to see your first school districts being formed there. And this was really the first form of having a public school where kids were able to go to school and it was available to whoever could get there and whoever could afford to help pay the teacher. Now, it was not public school in the way we know it, as it's free to anybody. Okay? But it was available to anybody if they could pay for it. And so you begin to have those first forms of public school in the New England states. And so as you shift down to the middle colonies, you begin to have, obviously, a diverse population there. In the New England states, you're going to have your primarily white families that have come from Europe. And as you venture further south into those middle colonies, you're going to have a little more diversity. And so you begin to have private schools, private venture schools, as they called it, where a lot of times these schools would teach different faiths. They would teach, some of the common religions at the time were going to be your Quakers and your Catholics and things of that sort. And so you had their faiths being brought in and taught in these schools. And again, a lot of it's because they were diverse in their population. Now, these schools also began to teach some vocational skills. You began to have, different skill trades that were being taught, because a lot of these people would have been from families who have trade backgrounds. They blacksmiths, or they do things from a trade standpoint. And so you had some of that being taught in these schools. And again, being a private school, these teachers are being paid by the parents. The parents are saying, okay, we want this teacher to come in and teach our kids, and here's what we want you to teach. And so you had the influence of parents a lot into these schools because they're the ones paying for it. And then in the South, and this is probably what we're a little more common or a little more familiar with, you had a lack of formal education for a lot of people. And you can imagine why. You had a dispersed population. You didn't have a lot of people living close together, where in the New England states, you've got small states and you've got a bunch of people living close, right? And so you have more kids to be educated in one area, where in the South, you may have you may cover a lot of mileage before you actually find 50 kids that are school aged, especially in that time. And so you had a lack of formal education. You also had this huge class difference between, the middle to upper class and then the very, very low class. So you would have had a lot of farmers. You would have had, but when slavery was still a thing, you would have families that were slaves and they had kids, and so you have that population. And so you begin to see in the South, the education was primarily for wealthy white males. And that's pretty much it. I know that, like, even my grandmother grew up in Itawamba County, and I think she finished high school, but college was not a thing that she even considered, really, because it was just not something that women did. Now, my grandfather went to college, and he actually went to ICC, and then went to Ole Miss, and I think got a master's degree from Ole Miss, and so he was one of the first ones in his family to go get a college degree. And so it was something that he did, but it was a new thing. It was not something everybody did. I know my wife's mother-in-law, my wife's grandmother also didn't get an education. I mean, I think she dropped out of school when she was 14, maybe. She and my wife's grandfather got married at 14 or 15, and he was working, and I think maybe was in the military and some of those things, and so they'd started their life. And I think he did go to college and got some college education, but she didn't, and it was not a thought for her. It's just not what they did. And so even graduating high school was not a common thing. And so you had this wealthy white male that was getting as much education as they needed or wanted, and then everybody else was just kind of there. And so you had a lot of people that were just growing up on the farm, and they were helping their family's farm, or whatever the trade may have been their family was involved in, they just did that because that's what they knew, and they grew up doing that. And so you had a lot of families like that. What you did begin to see is private tutoring for wealthy people, meaning that, maybe not everybody had access to a school, but the wealthy, especially the white males, they would have private tutors that would come in to teach them, so they could get an education. They could go out into college, get a college degree, go into the, whatever the field is they chose, and they could make a lot of money. Could be business owners and that kind of thing. And so this is, again, colonial education. This is back early in the establishment of the United States. And so you've got these diverse goals and views of education. And now when you look at education, it's pretty much similar across the country. Obviously, there's some differences from state to state and that kind of thing, but there are a lot of similarities in the way schools are operating. So that brings us to the idea of a common school. So a common school is a school that was available to just the average person. If you were an average person and you wanted to get an education, there were common schools that allowed anybody to come. However, they weren't necessarily at the public's expense. And they weren't necessarily available to everybody. But this idea of opening a common school does provide just the average person. So let's say you have just an average middle class person that wants to get an education. Well, common schools would have allowed that. Where, especially in the South, before this time, the only way you were getting an education is if you were a very wealthy plantation owner type white male. If you weren't that, then you weren't getting an education. And so these common schools began to open up just as a way to allow average people to get an education. So there were some obviously people that wanted it and people that didn't. And as you'll find out with most educational situations, there are going to be people who are for and who are against every decision made in education. If you haven't seen that yet, you will see that. Everything from Common Core curriculum to how many days a school teacher should work, to how much teachers should get paid, to all of these things, right? They're all going to have people for and against every single time. So, some of the arguments for common schools was the idea that as a democracy, in the United States, we have a democracy, it depends on people being educated, right? So think about that. If you have people going to vote and they're uneducated and they don't know how to read and they don't know how to write and they don't know how to think for themselves, well, they're making decisions about who's running their town or their state or their country, and they really don't know enough to be able to make an educated decision, right? So a lot of it had to do with from the political side of you need to be educated. It also, people also thought that having this common school would promote a common American culture. So you teach what it's like to be an American in these schools. And you begin to teach cultural things along with your basic educational things like reading, writing, and arithmetic. You begin to expand that out into cultural issues as well. And so you begin to breed that American culture into your students who then, as they get older, continue to, to pass that along from each generation. And then it also provided an enhanced opportunity for just opportunity in general and also prosperity, a way to make money. If you grew up on a farm, then, and that's all you did, was you were just a farmer, well, there can be good money in that, but there can also be a lot of hard times financially. My grandfather grew up on a farm in Itawamba County, and he did not want to be a farmer. He wanted to do something else, and he's done a number of things from being a journalist and writing for a newspaper, actually owned a newspaper for a while, to being in the political realm. He was a member of the House of Representatives for a long time. He wanted to do something different than be a farmer. Now, he learned a lot of stuff from being on the farm. And he's one of those people that if you were to go talk to him, he would be glad to tell you all about it. But he did not want to do that for his career, for how he made his money and he lived his life. He didn't want to have to be doing it on the farm. And so he wanted education. And so this common school was a way to provide just an average kid a chance to get an education. And again, opportunities to make money and things of that sort. Get out of their current situation. People against it, obviously you can imagine who these people are going to be. These are going to be your white, wealthy males that say, we don't want anybody else being educated. We want to be the only ones with education, because in that comes some power, right? And so the arguments against it were that some citizens would pay for schooling of other children. That still happens today. If somebody doesn't pay taxes and somebody's living on welfare and choosing not to work, and I say choosing, there's a difference in not being able to work and choosing not to work. They choose not to work. Those are people that I'm paying for as a tax-paying citizen, and I really wish that those people would go work. I wish my money was not going to pay for people that can take care of themselves. Instead, I wish my money was going to take care of people who couldn't take care of themselves, which was the initial reason for things like welfare. And so you had this argument of, well, I don't want to pay for this person's kids to go get an education. I want to pay for my kids and my kids only. And so you had that idea. You also had the idea that it was going to weaken cultural identities as you introduce diverse groups. So again, we've talked about diversity, right? We know that our schools today are very diverse from a racial standpoint, from an ethnicity standpoint. And so as we have different cultural groups come in, well, that cultural identity begins to fade a little bit. We've talked about multicultural education, where you embrace all of those different cultures that your students come from. Well, the argument against common schools is, well, we're going to weaken that American culture that we're trying to teach, and it's not going to allow our American culture to grow and spread. And then there were concerns over religious teachings. And I get that, because one religious group may have completely different views religiously than another group. And so, as a parent, I don't necessarily want my kids being taught religion at school. Because if they're taught religion differently than I believe, well, then that's a problem. And fortunately, my son's teachers and my daughter's teacher last year all have the same religious belief as we do. And so, had they tried to teach some religion, I'd have been okay with it, because I know what they're teaching, because it's the same beliefs that I have. But that's not always the case. And so I don't necessarily want religion taught in the classroom, which is why it's typically not today. But at the time, when we're talking about these common schools being started, religion was a major part of schools. In fact, some schools went from, instead of having 3 R's, they went to the 4 R's. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. And so the argument against common schools was, well, if you start teaching religion, how do we know you're going to teach the right religion, or the religion that we want taught? And so you can imagine that too becomes a major, major problem. So let's talk about how elementary education developed. A lot of elementary education was influenced by European society and European schools. And you had these 4 people, and I'm not going to try to butcher their names. Again, in your book, it calls them by name, starting on page 311. If you want to look on page 311 through 312, you can see each of these people discussed. Each of these people brought something unique to elementary education. This first person brought kindergarten. So the idea of a kindergarten actually started in Europe, and this is one of the influences that has continued throughout our education system today. And it was this idea, the word kindergarten comes from the phrase children's garden, like a garden like you would plant. And the idea is that it's where children will go through pleasant activities such as songs and stories, and it was used to lay a foundation for formal education. And we know that kindergarten does play a big role in success in kids when they get into upper level schooling. That's been proven. There are studies that have followed students that took kindergarten versus those that didn't, and followed them through even into their adulthood to see, okay, how much did kindergarten play a role in their educational experience? And we see that it plays a huge role. And so this was one of the first things that was introduced from the European culture into the American education. And so you had experiments with kindergarten actually before the Civil War, but in 1873 a public kindergarten was established in St. Louis. So you may want to make a note of that. St. Louis, Missouri was where the first kindergarten started in the United States. And this idea spread rapidly. You can imagine as it is successful and kids coming out of kindergarten do well in the first grade and do well in the second grade and so on, you can imagine other schools say, hey, let's try that. Because one of the things about education is when one idea seems to be good, people want to take it and run with it. Even if it's kind of fluky that it had good results, people tend to want to take those things and run with them. And so we see that happen in St. Louis. The next person, again, I'm not going to try to butcher their names. Excuse me. So the next person was influential in the idea of wanting to influence students' heads, hearts, and hands. So let me write that down. Heads, hearts, and hands. Now, this was the idea of letting students be active, not just pouring things into their head, but also teaching them to rely on attitudes of acceptance and love of individual students, and really the teacher pouring everything they have into each student and getting to know the kid and getting to a point where there's a really close relationship and the students just have this connection with their teachers. You can look at teachers that are good teachers at the elementary level, and you can see the ones that have students that just absolutely love their class. For example, my daughter, she's been very fortunate. Kindergarten and first grade both, she had phenomenal teachers. Her kindergarten teacher, she loves to this day. We see her out occasionally, and she runs up to her and gives her a hug and just talks about her and misses her and just absolutely loves this teacher, because this teacher not only just poured out information, but she got to know them. She got to know the kids, and she spent time with them on a personal level, not like out of school necessarily, but she just got to know them so well that she knew what they were into, and she knew what they enjoyed, and she knew so much about them that they felt like she had an investment into them. And so that idea was started by this second person. Again, I'm not going to try to butcher a name here, but you begin to see that. The next one, this person, Herbart, maybe is how you say that. They were and it's Johann. Let me make sure I'm saying that right. Yeah, Johann Herbart. And they were influenced by this person, Pestalozzi, and this idea of getting to know the kids and really pouring yourself into it. But they felt like the primary purpose of education was moral development. They felt like that was one of the main reasons that you go to school. And we know that you do teach morals to an extent, right? We've talked about morals and ethics and all those things. And those get taught at school, especially at the elementary level. You do begin to see that being taught. And then this last person, Maria Montessori, again, I'm butchering names. I said I wasn't going to do that. she was influential in introducing the idea of learning through senses. So I'm just going to say learning through senses, where you're active, you feel, you touch, you do all of these things, and made it go away. You are active and you're involved and you're doing all these things. You're hearing, you're seeing, you're touching, you're feeling. You've got all your senses involved. Probably not tasting a whole lot, but maybe you have smells and those things as well. And the more senses you can incorporate, the better off you're going to be, because you're going to learn more about what's happening. Okay, so each of those people were influenced by European education, and so they bring these things to the United States, and that begins to impact how we look at education. And so all of that led to you're starting to see a change in curriculum. So instead of our curriculum being strictly reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion, well, now you begin to see it change. And you begin to see teachers venturing out and teaching more things like moral development, and teaching in different ways where you are letting the students be active. And you really begin to see really the progressive philosophy of education that we talked about in Chapter 9. It really kind of starts here. When these different ideas get introduced into education, the progressive educator is going to want to try new things. Let's try things that are different. Let's try to help all students, not just these that get the lecture or these that do well sitting still in a desk. And again, that's really important in the elementary education. And you also begin to see consolidation. And the reason consolidation happened is because as school districts that had less money, they were poorer, they began to not be able to provide the educational opportunities that the wealthier ones could. And you still see that today. You know, there are some school districts, my wife and I were talking in this time of being primarily online, there are some school districts that are just still clicking along, and they are still having school just like they would if they were in school, and they're doing everything online. Well, Itawamba County schools, for example, don't have the technology for every student, and not every student is going to have access to internet and the availability to continue to have class online. Now, teachers send out stuff, and teachers can reach out to students, and they can, send text messages and send websites and all these things to try to encourage students to do stuff. But they can't do what I'm doing, make a video of a lesson and post it on YouTube and say, all right, go watch this, and then we're going to take a test. That's not feasible in some counties that don't have the money. You look at school districts like Tupelo and Oxford, a lot of those school districts, they have the technology, and every student has an iPad or a laptop. And so if they don't have internet access, they can go sit in a parking lot at McDonald's or somewhere and probably get internet access and be able to do their work. Or maybe go sit in the school parking lot and be able to do their work. And so you do have access there for a lot of students, where in Itawamba County, if you're not from Itawamba County, you may not realize how poor that the county is in areas, and there's some kids that just do not have the access. And so that consolidation happened because the poor districts could not provide the opportunities that the wealthier ones could. And so what you begin seeing is that smaller districts got unified into larger, or got consolidated into larger school districts. So you also had, along these lines, issues with transportation. So I'll ask you this just to think about. What invention would help consolidate schools? How would that become easier for schools to consolidate? So the answer would be school buses, right? Because if I can take a kid or a group of kids, 30 kids, 50 kids, whatever it is, that live on one side of the county, and I can bus them all at once to a school, and then I can come back and pick them all up and take them back home, well, that's pretty easy then to say, okay, this one school that has 50 kids in it, we're going to close that school, and then we're going to take y'all to this other school across the county or across town or wherever it may be. And so the school districts, especially when automobile transportation became popular, became something that people were doing, some of the first school buses made this consolidation easy. Because before school buses, you'd have a group of 50 kids or so from an area, and they'd say, well, we don't have anywhere else to go. We can't just all pack up and go by horseback or buggy or whatever to some other school. And so you had a lot of moving schools. You would have teachers that would go from one community to another community to another community across the day, maybe go teach 2 or 3 different schools. But then when school buses became a thing, schools started busing students to the school, and that way teachers could stay at the school and they could have more students come in. And so those were some of the major developments in elementary education. And so as we talk about the progressive nature of elementary education, these principles that work their ways in, really coming from Europe, you had several things, and we see this even today. You had the idea that the child should have freedom to develop naturally. We know that students all learn at different rates. Some are really good in some areas, some are not good in some areas, and so the child should have freedom to develop naturally. Natural interest is the best motive for work. We've talked about that a little bit. If we can work in things students are interested in, that's going to benefit them because they're going to be more interested in doing the work because it revolves around something they enjoy. The teacher is the guide, not the taskmaster. Again, as we're trying to influence the hearts and minds of our students, it is not going to be as easily done by just the teacher trying to pour stuff in their head, right? But it's guiding their thinking process, making them learn through thinking and problem solving. You also begin to see student development that's measured scientifically, not just by grades. So again, you may have a kid that's really good in some areas, really talented in areas, and if you judge them just strictly on grades, well, that may or may not give a great picture. You know, we still do that today where we use grades primarily, but there are other ways to measure student development. And so that's why you have standardized tests. That's why you have those things that measure where students are academically. You also begin to see an attention to health and physical development. You know, the idea of having PE and keeping students active, because again, as we're trying to reach their hearts and minds and hands and get them going and doing, we begin to see that, well, if they're physically active, that helps their mental stimulation. It helps them be able to think better, helps them do better in school. And then the school and the home must work together. So previously, the parents would say, I'm paying you, here's what you teach my kid. Well, now this progressive education is going to work hand in hand with the home, but not only be guided by what the parents say. And then you see progressive schools that serve as leaders in trying new educational ideas. This is one thing I try to do in my classes. Not as much necessarily in this class, but in my math classes a lot of times, especially at the high school level, I would try new things just to see if it had an impact. Because I knew that sometimes some of the things I did in class probably wasn't going to be all that beneficial to my students. And so I wanted to try other things to help them be more successful. And so if somebody said, well, I did this in my class and it worked really well, I may say, well, I'm going to try that. And I've even done that at the college level. I just don't do it as much because I have a routine that works pretty well for most students. And so I don't venture off of that a whole lot. But especially when I started out teaching, if somebody said, well, I tried this and I did this activity with it and my students really seemed interested in and really seemed to get the concept, I very easily would try that because I want my students to be successful and I want them to be able to get the content that I'm teaching. And so, again, I feel like I fall under the progressive philosophy. You may or may not, but these are some of the main ideas that are influencing elementary education. We will stop this video. We will pick up with the next video talking about